Hello everyone, it's Cameo. Welcome back to my channel. It's been a long time, and as you can see, I'm in a new setting, so I'm still kind of figuring out where is the best place to film in this new flat of mine, but this is kind of nice, I thought, with the wee plants behind me. Anyway, so today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in October. And I read, 5 books in October, which might not seem like very much, but I also started a few that I haven't finished yet, but I'll be talking about those in a later video. Most of the books that I'm talking about I read on my Kobo, and then I listened to 2 audiobooks, so I only have one physical book to show you, but I'll put up pictures here, I guess, blocking the poor plant. It was a pretty good reading month, except for one book which I really didn't like, that I'll be getting to that soon. So the first book that I read was Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History by Bill Schutt. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm kind of obsessed with this topic, like not in a morbid way, but something that I think that's really interesting, like cultural taboo around cannibalism. And I thought this was like a really good book to provide sort of an overview of it. He is a biologist, so he talks a lot about cannibalism in nature. That's how the book starts off. And then he also covers some survival cannibalism, like the Donner Party, and also ritual cannibalism. But he does avoid talking about criminal cannibalism because he wants to avoid sensationalizing it. So I think that that's pretty good. I'm kind of a true crime fan, so I kind of get enough of the criminal cannibalism in the various podcasts and whatnot that I listen to. In this case, his objective was to avoid sensationalism and to kind of explore why there is a cultural taboo around cannibalism, and also basically naturalize it by talking about how common it is in nature, and maybe it's not that unusual for humans to also practice it in certain situations. So I found the cultural comparisons quite interesting. He kind of contrasted the really severe taboo in Western cultures against cannibalism with some other cultures where it's not as much of a taboo. Although I kind of wish that he would have gone a bit more in depth about the psychology of cannibalism and like why we have such a strong taboo against it in Western cultures. He kind of comes down to the conclusion that it's because of classical literature, like that we got it from the Greeks basically, but I kind of think like where did they get it from? It just kind of keeps going back and back, but I kind of think that really there is not like a firm answer about why we have such a strong taboo about it, while other cultures don't. And another thing maybe connected to that dissatisfied me a little bit was just I felt like he could have gone more in depth about quite a lot of things, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because I don't think he set out for it to be very like a detailed, serious book. His tone is very, very light and really quite funny. He cracks a lot of jokes, but like I said, I wouldn't have minded a bit more exploration of the complexities around the issue. The sections where he's talking about the science behind cannibalism and the biology of it are in depth enough for me. I think as somebody who's not a scientist, he was really good at keeping the science to a level that I think anybody could understand. I only got a little bit confused in the later sections where he was talking about mad cow disease, but I think that those sections in general were like a little bit confused in comparison to the previous sections in the book, which were really well structured. So in those sections, towards the end of the book, what he was doing was that he was comparing ritual cannibalism, and specifically the side effects of ritual cannibalism. He was comparing that to mad cow disease. So he was talking about Kuru, which is the neurodegenerative disorder that has been linked to cannibalism in humans, to mad cow disease, which is a similar disorder. So that was very interesting, and he talked a lot about some scientific kind of advances in the research around these neurodegenerative diseases and whether they're caused by this specific type of like protein that has something wrong with it, or if it's potentially like a virus even though it's quite accepted that it's not a virus, there's some interesting kind of evidence that it might actually be a virus that we just haven't detected yet. So that was really interesting. But what I appreciated about his book in general, and like those sections at the end, even though they were a little bit like more disorganized than some of the other sections, was like he was very aware of the way that sensationalizing cannibalism in the past has really justified a lot of historical atrocities directed towards indigenous people by white colonizers. So that awareness kind of created an undertone, like a healthy skepticism towards the anthropologists that he was talking about who were studying ritual cannibalism, and a sensitivity in the sections where he was talking about Kuru. By comparing it to mad cow disease and exploring like the similarities in those diseases, he's putting those two diseases on this like level ground in rooted in science. And he takes away any kind of like moral elements that may be present there, where I think because there could be this conception in the West that that's kind of like almost a punishment for cannibalism, which we think is so wrong. So I kind of thought that there were some complexities in the book, and overall I really, really enjoyed it. And he's a bat biologist, and he's also written a book on animals that feed on blood. So I think that that is something that I'm also really interested in because I love bats, and even though I'm not interested in vampires, as you will see later in this wrap up, I am interested in animals that feed on blood and like the cultural taboos around that as well. So I'm really eager to read that book by him as well. Okay, so the next book that I read was this one right here, which is Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White. And I got this book because I kind of wanted a spooky read for October. So this is my first Wilkie Collins book. I've never read anything else by him, although I had a hard time choosing between this book and The Moonstone, which also sounds really good. And I kind of was drawn to that one more because I know that this one is written in sort of letters and journals, and normally I kind of shy away from that, but it didn't bother me at all in this case. So this book is kind of about this man who is walking home one night, and this woman comes out of nowhere and basically asks him for help, and she's dressed all in white, and it's really mysterious. And then he goes to this big house to teach these two young women how to draw, and kind of gets involved in their lives, and they are kind of involved with this strange woman, and it all unfolds from there. So I was kind of a bit like worried at the beginning when I started reading this because there was some weird gender stuff going on. Like for example, the first time we meet the character Marion, is that her name? Yes. She's kind of described as having this ideal feminine body as the male narrator approaches her, and she has this beautiful ideal feminine body, but then she turns around and her face is really masculine, and he describes her as having sort of like facial hair and stuff even, which obviously is not at odds with being feminine, but in this case he's like very deliberate about it. And then later on this character's nemesis, who is a man, is described as really being very effeminate. So it's obviously a deliberate kind of choice on Wilkie Collins' part, and he also has Marion making sort of really self-deprecating jokes about being a woman and like women's capabilities and stuff like that. So I was kind of like, where is he going to go with this? Is it going to be like this kind of uncomfortable all the way through the book? But actually it's kind of like very interesting. I found his exploration of gender very interesting. Even though Laura as a character is very typically kind of the helpless, kind of angelic woman in this book who's kind of very much a victim, Marion is a very interesting character and incredibly capable. I think that Wilkie Collins is clearly very interested in the limitations that are placed on women in this society, and clearly his characters have like a very realistic frustration with the limitations that their gender places on them. The plot clearly couldn't happen at all if women had the same social powers as men, and all of the characters know it and use it to their advantage or not. So overall, I really liked this. His writing style was much more appealing than I was expecting it to be, and also his characterization was more appealing than I thought it was going to be. I feel like I had heard somewhere before that his characters are very wooden, and I thought that they were actually really well drawn and really psychologically complicated, especially the women. So I kind of really like this and look forward to reading more Wilkie Collins someday, maybe next autumn. Okay, so the next book that I read was also very surprising, but like in the worst way possible. So it was The Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness, I think. Sorry, I can't remember her name. Okay, so I should say before I'm talking about this, I don't think I'm going to be able to avoid spoilers because there's some stuff I need to rant about. So if you're planning on reading this, maybe just skip to the next book. I'll put up a picture of the cover here so you'll know that I've started talking about something else. And I was kind of thinking this could be a similar sort of spooky October read. You know, it's about witches. It starts off as being about this academic who's studying alchemical, like old alchemical texts in Oxford, and she's this really gifted scholar, and she's also a witch and kind of like struggling with accepting the fact that she's a witch because she kind of has disavowed that and has basically got to where she is in her career through just as if she was a human, like through her own powers without any help from witchcraft. So that starts off pretty good. And then this vampire comes into her life and it keeps like following her around and it's kind of mysterious. And I was thinking to myself, God, this is like really creepy. I'm glad that she's portraying him as being like really creepy and like, but no. It basically was like a thinly veiled vampire romance novel, just another one with exactly like most of the same problems that I've come across in like other ones, like even Twilight and stuff like that. So I ended up being quite dissatisfied with this. Its representations of gender, like let's just say that Wilkie Collins, a Victorian man, has done a better job exploring gender stuff than this woman, even though it was written also by an academic who, like, so I thought that this would be like more interesting and more like in depth, but actually it wasn't. So vampire novels in general aren't really my thing. I kind of like, maybe there are a few movies I like that involve vampires, but it's not something that I really enjoy reading about, like, and especially romance novels. I was there for the witches, but there was like almost no witchy stuff in it, unfortunately. Maybe towards the end, which is why I actually finished listening to this because I was listening to it on audio. But by that point, there were so many things that I didn't like about it that it couldn't make up for it even at the end there. The writing style was also really slow, which normally I don't mind, but if it's got sort of like a psychological purpose or some kind of like meaning to it. But this was really just like tedious, I felt. Like I felt like she would just describe things in so much detail that was just really unnecessary and didn't add anything to the plot or to the characters, their psychology. And I felt like the characters didn't feel like real people. It really, really bothers me that the main character meets this guy and then just basically abandons her academic career entirely, even though she spent her whole life working for it, and it just falls to the wayside. So, and she basically also loses all personality, and you kind of come to think like maybe she didn't have a personality to begin with. Another thing that really bothers me is that it doesn't challenge that thing about vampire romances where the vampire, it's like romantic that he's supposed to be super possessive and like obsessive and just a basically very unhealthy relationship. And it's kind of like, oh, because the main vampire man is a scientist and stuff like that, and he can explain it away as being, this is just in my nature. Like, no. It doesn't excuse the fact that it's really unhealthy to be very possessive of your partner and to be overly protective of them, disrespectful of their boundaries and things like that. And also kind of, so by the end it turns out that spoilers. It's basically like her destiny to have met him and to fall in love with him and to basically probably bear his child eventually. And her magical powers are even tied with him, so they're not supposed to awaken until she meets him and falls in love with him. And this is all like destiny, so she doesn't even really have a choice in the matter. And it just like, it bothered me so much. It just like kind of anti-feminist basically. And so I really didn't like so many of these things, and I really should have just stopped listening to it. Like I kept thinking to myself, like maybe I should just DNF this one. And my sister was also reading it, and she warned me. She warned me that it was going to be like this, and I still finished it. But lesson learned. Lesson learned. The next book that I read was A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, and I read that on my Kobo. It was a really lovely little book. It's a middle grade book about a boy whose mother is dying of cancer, and a monster comes and visits him one night and has to tell him 3 stories, and then eventually he's going to have to tell the monster a story. So it's kind of this lovely little like parable almost. It had a really beautiful structure to it, kind of reminiscent of, you know, fairy tales and various myths, even though the setting was really modern. The writing is very simple and straightforward. I think that the poetry of it is really in the structure and this kind of recurring storytelling that happens within it. And the character work is also really, really good. There's a really good balance of being limited to Connor's perspective, the main character's perspective, and his view of the world as somebody who's very young, but also like being outside that as a reader, being able to see beyond his limited understanding. So there's kind of like a dramatic irony to it almost. It's really beautiful. But it's also because it's about storytelling and about the stories that we tell ourselves, and about, especially in hard situations, the way that we can be really in denial and tell ourselves stories to protect ourselves. It's also about kind of what we refuse to see, and there's kind of a part of Connor that's withheld even from the reader until the very end. So I think that the fact that it's kind of about storytelling and the powers of storytelling, the shortcomings of storytelling, and how stories kind of can comfort us or harm us, it's really going to strike a chord with people who are readers. And it's really hard to sort of pull off writing about storytelling, I think. And I think that he did a really good job. It was very beautiful and very moving and very real. Like, it felt, even though it had a fantastical element to it, it was very psychologically, like, very real. The only regret that I have about the book is that I read it on my Kobo, because there was, even on my Kobo, it had some illustrations, but they were very small and I couldn't see them very well. And the illustrations are by Jim Kay, who I just love his work so much. He has done the illustrated Harry Potter editions as well, and his work is just so beautiful. And I think he really like captured the essence of this text, and I think it'd be worth buying in hardback. With the illustrations, so maybe I'll do that someday. And the last book that I read, or listened to rather, in the month was The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Again, I read this one last year. I just cannot help myself when it comes to Lord of the Rings in autumn. I just think that the beginning of The Fellowship of the Ring is like the most autumnal thing ever. So I really wanted to get it on audiobook. Listen to it as I was walking around and the leaves were falling, and it was everything that I hoped it could be. The narrator for the book is Rob Inglis. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but he was just amazing. He's exactly what I imagine Tolkien sounds like. I picture him as like Tolkien. It just was really perfect, and the production was really good. They have, he does the songs and everything, like he sings them. So I really would recommend that production if you want to listen to this on audiobook. I can't decide if I'm going to get the next ones and listen to them, or if I'm going to read them when I get the chance, because it's been quite a long time since I've read the second and third books, because I like always just start from the beginning and then I never get around to finishing them. And also my favorite part is the autumnal lovely part rather than like the depressing, gloomy later books. But I think it's about time that I actually like finished the full series, because it's been years and years. So that's what I read in October. I hope you liked this video. I'm going to be doing a video soon about what I'm currently reading, and also some nonfiction books that I'm planning on reading in November, because it's nonfiction November, as most of you probably know. Yeah, so like this video and subscribe if you would like to, and I'll see you next time. Bye!